Thanks very much, everyone, for coming today for this event. My name is Rory Collins. I'm the head of the Nuffield Department of Population Health. So just to introduce my co-chair, Patricia Kingori, who's a sociologist based at the Ethox Centre within the department. And she's principal investigator of a Wellcome Trust-funded project on fakes, fabrications, and falsehoods. So she's definitely in the right place for this meeting. And she's leading a team of interdisciplinary researchers who are seeking to explore what we can learn from fakes in health and science. And she's going to help me to co-chair this panel and try to extract from them their ideas about what we can do better in the future. I'll just give some opening comments, and then Patricia will also do so. And then we've asked each of the speakers to speak for about 5 minutes, just to set the scene, and particularly asking them to talk about what they think has been some of the major problems with uncertainty in dealing with the pandemic, misinformation, whether deliberate or not, and how that has affected the way in which the UK and other places have been able to deal with it. Obviously, the whole issue of disinformation, so deliberate misinformation, misinformation itself, and uncertainty are not new. This is actually the second such event we had. The first, in all ignorance of what was just about to hit us, was in January of 2020, when we were here with Damien Collins, the chair of the Select Committee on Health, and Simon Stevens, who soon found himself with a bit of an experience on his hands as the head of the NHS. Someone actually who seems to have managed to come through the pandemic without having had his reputation shredded. So clearly a very successful individual, one to watch. The emergence of the pandemic clearly created a situation in which scientists were trying to generate information against huge pressures about something that was completely new. And I think one of the questions we want to ask is, given that you don't know what's going on, given that there's uncertainty, what do you do? You don't know that this is the one. You don't know that this is an infection that's going to turn into an epidemic, into a pandemic. And so there may well be things that in retrospect would seem obvious, in prospect are not so obvious. The politicians are obviously pressing scientists to come up with certainty and are really not very happy with the idea of uncertainty. So how does one present to politicians, to policymakers, to the public at large, that uncertainty is actually the best that you can do in those circumstances? And clearly we all saw high-profile figures, some in the scientific community, some beyond, who knew what was the right thing to do, that they knew particular treatments worked, despite the lack of evidence, and were championing them really quite aggressively. And then, how do you actually get accurate information? How do you determine what is accurate, what is reliable, what is unreliable, and the role that social media and other modern channels of communication play in spreading both reliable information, but a lot of the time misinformation and disinformation. And how does that information itself create polarized opinions that then make it very difficult to get people to understand what is real and what isn't real? So, as I said, the aim of this discussion is to really discuss the things of, how could we do better in the future? How do you balance the desire to act fast with the need for reliable evidence on what to do? How can scientific journals determine what research is sufficiently reliable? And I think we'll ask Richard Horton to give us his thoughts about that from the perspective of the editor of The Lancet. And I said, how can reliable information be distinguished from misinformation, disinformation, particularly in a rapidly changing situation where the virus is changing, the spread is changing, knowledge is changing? How does one deal with the fact that you say something today and you realize actually that it's not accurate? The idea that people can change their minds as the evidence changes, and that is not evidence of weakness, it's actually evidence of strength. So although the timing of this event may seem particularly precise in terms of overlapping with the start of the COVID-19 inquiry, is completely coincidental, trying to get these three in the same room at the same time. We have Peter Horby's flown back from China just yesterday, so he can tell us what the situation is there. He said conspiracy theorists can enjoy the fact that he's been over in China so recently, so there you are on that side. But we're not trying to find out who got it wrong. What we're trying to think about is how could you get it better in the future. So I'll hand over to Patricia, who, as I said earlier, is particularly expert in this whole area, to expand a little bit more on this issue of disinformation, misinformation, and uncertainty. Patricia.
Thanks very much and good evening. I thought I'd go around the safe way. We'd worked the chairs out the safest way, but actually I didn't risk falling off and feeding into some kind of conspiracy theory even more. I'm actually going to just keep my introduction really brief, actually, because I know that you've really come to speak and hear from the panel members, but I think it's one of the biggest understatements to say this is a huge topic. It's a huge subject of debate. I don't even know how much inroad we're really going to be able to make today, but it's really great to be able to have the panel members really talk on this issue of trust, uncertainty, misinformation and disinformation, and really try to make an inroad into what is the kind of subject of our time. How do we even discern these two things? The distinction being that misinformation is often something that's unintentional, and disinformation being seen to be intentionally trying to derail or have a political agenda. So these are really hot topics, and they're live topics. We're really trying to understand them, and for us to even try to discern what some of these things are is really complicated. But I'm hoping that tonight we can actually make an inroad into this subject. And so we're going to make a start. I want to introduce our first panel member, Devi Sridhar. So Professor Sridhar, I'm just going to make sure that I've got you right here, Devi. I don't want to miss, here we go. Is author of Preventable, How a Pandemic Changed the World and How to Stop the Next One. So it's a big book, a big subject. And so Professor Sridhar holds a chair in global public health at the University of Edinburgh. She was formerly at Oxford. And she's a founding director of the Global Health Governance Programme. During the pandemic, many of you might have read her articles in The Guardian. She wrote several times, and she was very frequent in the media. There were sort of pros and cons of that. She might touch on what that was like, actually, being at the forefront of some of the information that was coming live. She's also a member of the Scottish Government COVID Advisory Group. So, Debbie, can I just hand over to you? Thank you. Whoa.
Careful. So it's great to be back in what I call tropical Oxford, coming from the frozen north of Scotland. I first arrived here in 2003 from Miami, and arrived with my suitcase full of flip-flops and swimsuits from where I was from, and I've done the same this time, coming down. This is my summer holiday out of the frozen north, and yeah, I'm a bit nervous to do this. I've been a little bit on TV, just a tiny bit during the pandemic, but I have my two doctoral advisors here, Nari Woods and David Gellner, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that the only reason I'm here on this stage is because of the people who help you, and they both helped me on my way. And I did get things wrong during the pandemic Some of you might have grievances over things I said that you disagreed with, or you think, oh, you got that. I know we all made mistakes, but any complaints about me, it's actually kind of their fault because, you know, like you blame your parents, you blame your academic parents, and they're my academic parents, and it all goes back to your childhood, doesn't it? So, okay, so the organizers are like, they wanted me to focus. This is a senior, sober occasion. We're in the Sheldonian. And what I want to talk about is take you back to early 2020. And I want you to imagine you're sitting on a Zoom call with other advisors and senior ministers, whether it's the First Minister of Scotland, education ministers, and the topic is children. And they've asked you, what's the risk of COVID-19 to children? Will they get sick if we keep schools open and if children become infected in a wave? So at first, pediatricians weren't that concerned. Children die of a number of things, but largely not infectious diseases today in Western countries like Britain. And COVID was seen as a disease of old people. This is what was being told from out of China and Wuhan. But red flags started going up when Lombardy, Italy reported a 30-fold increases in cases of what they called pediatric inflammatory multi-system disorder. This was a Kawasaki-like disease where children would have a very high temperature, abdominal pain, and go into cardiac arrest. So quite a serious disease. And what was puzzling pediatricians is that they were negative on PCR tests, but they were positive on antibody tests. So it seemed like a delayed reaction that they were having several weeks later. And in the UK, pediatricians raised the flag as well. When the UK wave started, I know there was a lot of news that might have got missed, but 78 children ended up in ICU with this condition, most requiring life support. And a senior consultant at the time said, we are gearing to take adults. This issue completely blindsided us. No one told us kids were going to be coming in. So go back to that meeting, and you're being asked, what's the risk to COVID-19 to children? Data is essential. You have to know what's the prevalence, and that's what ministers wanted to know. Is this 1 in 100 kids? Is it 1 in 1,000? Is it 1 in a million? Because that would shift their cost-benefit calculations and the trade-offs they were making about the costs of school closures, which are massive, with, of course, the risk to children. Who is this affecting? Why is this occurring? And pediatricians didn't have answers, which meant communicating risk to parents who were saying, can I send my kids to school? And to ministers was very tricky. And it was hard internationally. Our team, what we did was looking at other countries. So one of the members of my team, Adriel Chen, he's a pediatrician. And I said, contact South Korea, contact pediatricians there. Have they seen it? Because if it's happening here. But they came back from South Korea saying they hadn't seen it, but they hadn't taken a wave of infections. They had contained it really quickly, so they hadn't had many children affected. And the places that had been hit, Lombardy and New York City, and I think The Lancet might have published one of these places, were sending out warning signals and saying, something is happening that's disturbing. Would you give the advice to open schools? Would you advise to say we need to wait for more data? Would you say we just don't know? Eventually, it did become clear by the summer that this condition is rare, and it became more rare as we had new variants, which we don't luckily seem to be seeing this in children. But when schools were first closed across the world, the concern was over what is happening in children. And the bar for what's an acceptable toll of deaths in kids is one that's incredibly low. Compared to if we talk about over 60s, over 70s, it's just a fact. Every child death is seen as a preventable tragedy, under 5, under 10, under 20s. And so can you imagine if schools had stayed open and we'd seen a wave of cases, a month later, what would have been the responsibility of scientists? What would have been the responsibility of politicians? And I raise this because managing this uncertainty was at the heart of advising governments and in doing our media work. And I'll end by explaining how I tried to communicate through the pandemic and how I tried to communicate to ministers when they kept asking you and pushing you, we want answers. When is it going to end? Is there going to be a vaccine? Is long COVID, what's the prevalence? This is what we definitely know. This is what we think we know based on what we've been working on. And this is what we just don't know. And at the start, we didn't know a lot. This box was like this, and we didn't know much. This was a novel pathogen. But as 2020 has flowed by, we're now 3 years on, this box now, on what we don't know, has reduced. And now what we do know is pretty massive. We know a lot of things now, but we didn't know that back then. In the summer of 2020, there was a green light to get kids back for in-person learning because pediatricians said we've now assessed the situation to be that actually children should get back to school. But then the question turned to, what is the risk to adults of working in a school environment? To teachers, cleaners, assistants, helpers, are they at risk? What is the age profile, their health profile? Who are they living with? And unions came in to want to ensure their safety. But I'll stop here because that's a very different story for another day. Thank you very much.
So I'll now introduce Dr. Richard Horton, who's been editor-in-chief of The Lancet since 1995. I remember having dinner with him, I think, in 1994, where he said he was going to apply to be editor, but he thought he was one editor too early. But he was successful and has been the editor-in-chief there since then, after qualifying in physiology and medicine prior to that. He's the author of The COVID-19 Catastrophe, What's Gone Wrong and How to Stop It Happening. I was reading just the other day the last added chapter of the second edition of that book, when the vaccine had just arrived, and I think he was working on the proofs of the Oxford AZ vaccine as he wrote that chapter. So it'd be really interesting to hear from Richard, who I think is now working on another book, or working on the whole idea of developing the idea of planetary health, the health of human civilizations and the ecosystems on which they depend, which again, I think links into pandemics. So, Richard, thank you.
Much of my professional life seems to have been with me standing wedged between Rory Collins on one side and Richard Peto on the other, and here I am again. I should say Richard has the most effective way of getting a paper published in a journal. As the paper's going through peer review, he calls you up and he says, Richard, every day you don't publish this paper, another 50,000 people will die. In chic dinner parties in Silicon Valley, a fashionable game is to estimate P-doom. What is P-doom? P-doom is the probability of imminent human catastrophe. Now, Martin Rees, who's Astronomer Royal and a past president of the Royal Society, estimated that we only had a 50% chance of surviving to the end of this century. But even a 10% P-doom would be pretty catastrophic. This year, we launched at the Lancet a commission to examine 21st century threats to humanity, and you can imagine the usual list of suspects that we identified. But the leading topic amongst the group that we'd assembled was indeed misinformation. COVID-19 turbocharged the power of misinformation to destroy truth and, perhaps more importantly, trust. From Asim Malhotra, a British doctor who calls for the suspension of mRNA COVID vaccines based on the entirely false claim that their harm outweighs the benefits, to Didier Raoult, who is a French scientist whose own COVID research is now currently under criminal investigation for fraud. And yet they, and many others like them, have thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands, of devoted, utterly devoted followers. We're here to talk about COVID-19, but it's not only COVID-19, of course. A third of the British public think that it's true, or probably true, that the present cost of living crisis is a government plan to control you and I. We've taken the idea of truth, I would submit, far too much for granted. Jonathan Rauch, in his 2021 book, The Constitution of Knowledge, argues that the stability of our societies depends upon three operating systems. A political operating system that's about the distribution of power in society, an economic operating system that's about the distribution of scarce resources, and an epistemic operating system that is about how we generate truths and deploy truths in the decisions we make in our society. And I think it's fair to say that our epistemic operating system is presently extremely unwell. We do indeed live in a misinformation age where our view of ourselves has become dangerously distorted. We are not perfectly rational beings. We are prey to biases of novelty and conformity. We have a preference for negative news, and we too often believe what the next person tells us. And add to these all too human vulnerabilities the instruments of bad faith and propaganda, and one has a highly toxic recipe for epidemics of false controversy and doubt. And we became caught in the middle of one such global storm, in the spirit of confession that Rory has encouraged us to engage in, about the origins of the pandemic. Cast your minds back again, like Devi invited you, to early 2020. President Trump and others were quick to blame China for the pandemic. WHO was under attack for not calling out China more aggressively. And the media, and indeed the public, were actively xenophobic against Chinese citizens and other Asian populations. Amid this highly febrile political atmosphere, we published on February the 18th, 2020, a letter from Peter Daszak, Jeremy Farrar, and others that was labeled a statement in support of Chinese scientists, public health, and medical professionals who were combating the pandemic. But, fatefully, at the end of the letter, we published the line, "We declare no competing interests." And then, over the successive weeks and months, as the connections between Peter Daszak, his EcoHealth Alliance, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and the National Institutes of Health all came to be revealed in their glorious detail, the case against China, the American government, and Tony Fauci became alarmingly treacherous. At first, Peter Daszak denied that he had a conflict of interest. He said that his conflict of interest made him an expert. It wasn't a conflict. But 16 months later, way too late, he and we did publish a conflict of interest statement, far too late to quell those who'd already convicted Tony Fauci in the court of public opinion. Now, the standard rebuttal to this rather gloomy argument is that we live in a marketplace of ideas. The solution to lies is to overwhelm them with truths. But in a time of social networks, there is no marketplace of ideas. Mistrust polarizes us at every turn, and no amount of new or true information can easily restore trust or build a consensus around truth. So is that it? A gloomy ending to my few remarks. Should our P-doom be approaching or even exceeding Martin Rees's ruinous 50%? In a word, no. So let me end with a more hopeful view. Our fear of misinformation is just one manifestation of a human proclivity to believe that our society is going to hell, in a downward spiral into oblivion, that we're facing a fatal moral decline, that kindness, honesty, and human decency are slowly dying. But does the evidence support that bleak conclusion? Adam Mastriani and Daniel Gilbert from the United States recently reported in a far better journal than some that are represented tonight, Nature, data from over 12 million people in 60 countries across a time span of 70 years. And they found, indeed, that most people around the world did indeed think that human morality had declined. They believed that morality had declined because it does so as we get older, and we think that every new generation that follows us is substantially less moral than our own. But paradoxically, they also found that people's reports of the current morality of their contemporaries, those living in their own personal worlds, their relatives, their friends, their colleagues, they hadn't declined at all. And so they concluded that the widespread perception that we have of moral decline is actually a psychological illusion. The illusion of moral decline leaves us perilously susceptible to misinformation. Consider this example. If our Home Secretary claims that migrants are a threat to British values, as she does, and if we believe that we are now indeed living in a moral wasteland, our susceptibility to her illusion may well encourage us to believe her, with tragically inhuman consequences. The fact is, we don't live in a moral wasteland. We are just as kind, honest, good, and decent as we always were. And that's not a bad starting point to resist the deceptively attractive but socially calamitous inducements of today's propagandists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's my honour now to introduce you to Professor Sir Peter Horby. He is the Mo Family Foundation Professor of Emerging Infections and Global Health at the University of Oxford. He's also Director of the new Pandemic Sciences Institute and co-lead of the Recovery Trial. He's worked on epidemic-prone diseases for over 2 decades and advised numerous international and the UK government on epidemic preparedness, clinical research, clinical trial design, and infectious disease. He's a member of SAGE, chair of the new and emerging respiratory virus threats advisory group called NERVTAG. I think that's probably now, Peter. Please welcome Sir Peter Horby.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming to listen to us, and hopefully we can have an entertaining evening, an enlightening evening. Tour de force from the last speaker, and I'm thinking, God, how can I match that? And I thought, oh no, I can trump that. Your journal was, accused of hiding some conflicts of interest, where I was actually accused of causing the pandemic personally. Where somebody thought that the fact that, an emerging infectious diseases doctor happened to be in various places where emerging infectious diseases had outbreaks meant that perhaps I was in some way culpable. So a classic example of confusing association and causation. So when I was asked to talk at this event about misinformation, uncertainty, disinformation, I thought, God, where do I start? There is so much to talk about. And, when we were first giving advice, I was chairing NERVTAG before SAGE set up. And there was almost sort of blanket, complete uncertainty. We had very little idea what was going on. We knew there were some very sick people in Wuhan, and we knew that there was a coronavirus, but we knew almost nothing else, and it was very difficult. We were being asked lots of questions, and all sorts of questions. We've heard about schools, lots of questions about face masks and border closures and lockdowns and hand hygiene, all of those, riddled with uncertainty. And that was in my role as a scientific advisor. And then there's my role as a scientist, where we were running clinical trials with colleagues in China, and then later, with Martin's help, we set up the recovery trial together. And then I thought about that actually the thing in terms of misinformation that most directly affected me was some of the things around the recovery trial, because the other stuff we were giving scientific advice and the policy decisions were being made by politicians and policy advisors, whereas for the recovery trial, the decisions were ours, which drugs to put in, when to release the data, how to release the data. And so I thought I would talk about the sort of hydroxychloroquine issue. Now, the facts are that, hydroxychloroquine, had some merits as a drug to be evaluated. It was a well-known drug. It was relatively safe. It had good activity against viruses in the laboratory, but had never really been demonstrated to have antiviral activity in humans. But then none of the studies had been good enough or big enough. So there was a case to evaluate it. Which we did in good faith. We really didn't know if this drug would work or not. We picked the dose that we thought was the most likely to give the drug a good chance of showing efficacy if it did work, by picking the dose that we thought was safe, but also reached the antiviral targets, and we did a lot of work on choosing the dose. And it was the first result from recovery. It was the 5th of June, very early on, within 100 days, a very clear negative result in hospitalised patients. It really didn't work, and if anything, it was potentially harmful. Fair enough. But then the issue started to arise that grain of truth around, of what we'd done, there were some interpretations and some views. We'd only looked in hospitalised patients. Maybe we should have looked earlier. That's true. That's a valid criticism. We'd used a high dose. Perhaps it was too high a dose. That's a valid criticism. It was a dose we chose that we knew was high, but we thought it was a safe dose, and that was a valid criticism. But the problem starts when the valid criticism, the grains of truth, become bound up with misinformation, speculation, falsehood, misdirection. And when that misinformation falls on very fertile ground. And as a result of that, colleagues in the recovery trial, we were accused of, being incompetent, being controversial characters, being corrupt, and even being murderers. That dialogue is still ongoing. And we wanted to talk today about the impact of misinformation. I think the impact, there's the personal impact, but I really don't want to talk about that because we've had lots of praise and lots of plaudits, and a bit of criticism on Twitter really is neither here nor there. But I think it does undermine, trust in the scientific method and trust in scientists. And that has a really negative impact and a corrosive impact, not only because, patients are taking now treatments that are not only unproven, but proven not to work. I've been traveling a lot recently since international travel has opened up. And still, drugs that we know don't work are being recommended. I was talking to a colleague in Africa, and she's been recommended 4 times to have courses of azithromycin to treat COVID, and it's still in the national guidance when there's very clear evidence that it doesn't work. Hydroxychloroquine is still being given. It's still in some guidance. Convalescent plasma is still being given to hospitalised patients. So there's people getting drugs they shouldn't be getting, and there's people not taking drugs that they should be taking because some of the guidance doesn't take on board things that have been shown to be positive. And I think that not only so that's a direct impact on patients now, it has impacts on future development of improved care because people are less likely to be involved in research if they don't trust it, which makes it harder to change evidence and harder to sort of improve care. So what do we do? I think there's 2 things. One of them has been mentioned already by Richard about, I guess, flooding out the false information with true information. It's one thing to sort of directly challenge information which you think is incorrect or misinterpretation or false. But I think sometimes directly engaging with individuals is not the right way, and we should just be having a very active campaign of putting out what we think is the best evidence and explaining why we think it's the best evidence. But the second thing is those grains of truth, wrapped in sort of interpretation, misinterpretation, fall on fertile ground. And I think the question for others like Patricia, is why is the ground so fertile? I think there will always be people who have diverse views, some of which is valid, some of which is more extreme. But I think we've seen during the pandemic that those misinterpretations, those falsehoods fell onto very fertile ground. And I think there's deeper societal issues as to why that fertile ground has arisen, and we should address that in quite a deep way. And looking at a sort of broader issues about why society is wishing to believe things where the evidence is really very weak. So thank you very much.
So we're just going to kind of have a discussion among the group for a while, and then we'll open it up for questions from the floor. For people who are very high up, we may ask you to come down, but otherwise we'll try to get microphones to you. So I wonder whether I could just kick off to a general question in terms of what do you think could have been done better in the situation that you had? So where you don't know how things are going to evolve. But what could have been done better to have resolved major uncertainties, either in the early stages or later? Uncertainties, for example, around do masks work for people who are infected to stop spreading infection? Do they work to prevent people who aren't infected from getting infected? When one reads through the SAGE minutes, and I recommend it as a read, I wouldn't normally recommend reading minutes, but it's a really interesting way of seeing the kind of the huge uncertainty early on as to what was happening. And then as that it becomes clearer and clearer that the one is happening, having to think about how to deal with it. But do masks work? What kind of protections should one do? Should one go for some kind of targeted protection of the people who are at very high risk of death and disability? Should one lock down across the population? Should one, how does one give vaccines, for example? So we saw with the vaccine rollout that we started to have vaccines, but maybe not enough vaccine. We probably didn't have enough people to vaccinate. Were there ways in which one could have evaluated when to give the second dose, whether to give boosters? Were there missed opportunities, do you think, in terms of resolving uncertainty? I don't know whether any one of you wants to kind of kick off with that poison chalice of a question.
I'm happy to kick off on that. Because I think none of us will say there's simple answers, but I think what was fascinating in this pandemic was that different places were hit before others were. We didn't all get affected in January. So the epicenter was Wuhan, then it became the Diamond Princess cruise ship, then it became Lombardy, so I think that cross-country learning was so important to communicate. We maybe don't have an RCT if face masks work, but guess what? Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong are using these, and they seem to be managing their waves and communicating that to ministers and to the public, which is our standard of evidence was not going to be RCTs because we didn't have time. It had to be, what are other countries doing? What can we learn from them? Is it working in terms of bringing down their waves of infections and saving their hospitals? And what are the gaps? And that international learning, sometimes I felt, and I kind of sat on various advisory groups, whether New York City, the state of Kerala, in Melbourne in Australia, it was like they were in a bubble sometimes, in Scotland as well. And I was like, we're having the same questions and debates. And on face masks, I just saw my postdoc doctor, Ines Hassan, who's here, and if you catch her at the reception or afterwards, she can tell you about the uncertainty we faced on face masks and the difficulty. And I just felt we spent too long debating, do face masks work? And that isn't even the question in my mind. It was, what are the costs of face masks? The cost in terms of actually getting them, that people don't like them, that kids want to see faces, that we are social beings, and accepting that people don't like them, with the benefit in terms of preventing infection. And I think if we communicated that, which is, yes, they're a pain in the butt, we don't want to wear them, but wear them in this context for this length of time because of this, we maybe would have gotten less of a debate rather than the circular debates of, do lockdowns work? Do face masks work? Of course lockdowns work. You lock people in their houses, they can't mix. Mixing is what spreads it. The real question is, do the harms of lockdown actually outweigh what you're trying to solve? Is it a proportional response? And so sometimes I felt we framed the questions not correctly in media debates, or I'll stop here. There's one I was in, which is, should we sacrifice the old for the young? I'm like, this is the most pointless debate I'm having, but you end up being drawn into them, and then they're saying yes or no. And I'm like, it's not a yes or no question we're in, it's a complex one, so yeah.
Just taking the face masks example, so I was looking through the SAGE minutes. So the 27th SAGE meeting minutes on the 21st of April concluded there was only weak evidence for infectious people wearing masks, that is source control, or mask wearing protecting people from being infected, and only recommended cloth face masks for a short period in enclosed spaces. And then I was reading Kate Bingham's book, and if you haven't read The Long Shot, I would strongly recommend it. It's very entertaining. And if you haven't heard her speak, do listen to her at the Remains lecture that she gave in this hall about 2 years ago, which was a masterclass in excoriating discussion. But she said in June 2020, she went to number 10 to talk about her work looking after the vaccine task force. She came in, and she was led in and told by the assistant that the Prime Minister was ready to see me and I could take off my face mask. Masks are not required, she was told, for business meetings. She goes on to comment in her book, SARS-CoV-2, it seems now respected professional commitments. I'd not been aware that the virus was capable of so cleverly discriminating between those it infected. So, by June, couldn't we have actually evaluated it more effectively than just comparing different populations with different circumstances and actually found out? Wouldn't that have helped, as did the recovery trial of hydroxychloroquine, help by overwhelming uncertainty with truth? But
so, is this working? Yeah, okay. What could we do better? Well, I think, I'll come back to the masks things. I think there's two things. Greater transparency. If you look at the SAGE minutes, they're pretty thin. I was at most of the SAGE meetings, and a lot was talked about, and they were pretty thin. Now, that a lack of secretariat support shouldn't be an excuse for having thin minutes. I think having more detailed minutes would help. In NerveTag we tried to have much more detailed minutes, and now going back in the face of the upcoming COVID inquiry, actually having those detailed minutes is really helpful because you can really be reminded of the debate that happened. The uncertainty is much clearer. So I think having the SAGE minutes were not released and made public early enough. So I think that's one thing. Better transparency. And I think also better diversity of views. I think face masks, is a good example. And there was challenge around the face masks. We were giving advice from NerveTag about face masks, and we were coming very much from a public health epidemiology scientific approach, which was, there's lots of evidence in laboratories of things that work that don't work in real life. Hydroxychloroquine's one in terms of therapeutics. And face masks are another one where they filter 95% of particles in the laboratory, but all of the randomized evidence shows that in the community that they have a much lower effect, around 10% effectiveness in reducing transmission, because people don't wear them properly. They take them off and they get wet and it's uncomfortable and you touch your eyes. And so we were approaching it from that perspective and giving the numbers, but actually perhaps we should have had a more diverse view, which is, okay, actually what's the harm, what's the societal harm, 10% on top of layered interventions. Maybe it is a worthwhile intervention. So I think we didn't quite have the diversity that we should have done.
Can I just mention one thing I think we could have done better with vaccines? And this comes from the human behavior literature. And that's the idea not of debunking misinformation, but pre-bunking misinformation. When the mRNA vaccines were clearly successful, we had kind of wasted a year where we could have been preparing the population for these vaccines, which nobody had kind of heard of before. So I remember the debate saying, well, how is it that we've suddenly got an mRNA vaccine and we only started the pandemic in January? I mean, this is ridiculous. Clearly, they haven't been through proper safety checking. They haven't been through proper efficacy testing. I mean, these cannot be safe vaccines. And in fact, when BioNTech started, literally in January, when the first papers were being published in the last week of January, that they were building on 20 years of work of mRNA technology. And that message never really came out in the discussion about the safety of mRNA vaccines, even with Asim Malhotra. If we had started early in the pandemic saying, we have these, as we did, we have these programs for vaccines taking place, let's talk about these vaccines now. If they are successful, they are built on 2 decades of laboratory research, which shows their incredible potential, their efficacy, and from those early studies, their safety. And then I think we could have subverted some of the criticism. So pre-bunking, thinking ahead of what the likely controversies are going to be, and starting a dialogue with the public so that you are transparent, but you're transparent before the fact, not after the fact. And you're trying to build trust about something that's going to be coming forward. And I think then the public sees that you're trying to forge a relationship with them about the future, rather than simply presenting a fait accompli and saying, it's all fine, trust us. That's just not good in the present age.
Shall I ask another question?
So do you think that there are other areas where one could have evaluated things better, or where actually the approach that was taken created uncertainty? You mentioned hydroxychloroquine, and of course in the US, the US Food and Drug Administration refused to allow, really, the randomization of convalescent plasma. I think over 100,000 Americans were given convalescent plasma with the idea that that would give them antibodies that would protect them. There was no proper evaluation of that in an observational study. Obviously, opportunity costs of doing something that may or may not work. And it was only a really kind of recovery that by randomizing was able to show that it wasn't worthwhile. I mean, do you think that the decision of the FDA there made it more difficult in a way to resolve uncertainty rapidly?
Yeah, I mean, talking about evaluation of things, I think certainly the FDA didn't cover itself in glory, did it? It gave emergency use authorization for hydroxychloroquine, treated 100,000 people plus with convalescent plasma, which if they'd randomized 10% of those would have given them an answer straight away. But if you think, it was a year before we had vaccines, really. And in that year, what was controlling the epidemic to any extent was social measures, was multi-layered social measures. It was can you test and trace, quarantine, isolation, social distancing, face masks, hand washing, all those issues. And almost none of those things have been properly evaluated. I mean, we know that if you use the nuclear option and you just shut down society, of course you reduce transmission, but there must be more smarter ways to introduce and target the interventions. But there were almost zero evaluations. I mean, there was, I think, just one randomized trial of face masks done, and I think there were real missed opportunities there. And going forward, there are initiatives around drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics. There's a 100 days mission. The ambition to have diagnostics, drugs, and vaccines available for evaluation within 100 days of a pandemic being evaluated. But I haven't seen any plan for evaluating actually what's probably more important, which is the public health measures, because they're the ones that you will rely on straight away. And they're also the ones that probably have the biggest potential unintended and adverse consequences. And I don't see any models being proposed about how you're going to evaluate those in a robust way, which is not easy for those kind of interventions.
I don't know, with Patricia, you want to kind of kick off on the sort of trust and trustworthiness or other aspects?
Yeah, I think one of the questions I wanted to ask you, so if you spend as much time as I do looking at misinformation on social media, one of the things that becomes really clear very quickly is that most of the people will start by saying, I'm Professor so-and-so, I'm Dr. so-and-so, I'm at this Ivy League university, I'm at Oxford, and or I'm a nurse here, or I've been a doctor here for a really long time. And credentials matter, expertise matter. So how does this work in terms of who the public trusts? Does everything just get reduced to a matter of opinion? This professional, equally qualified, thinks this, and this professional, equally qualified, thinks that? Or what do you think is the way out for the public to deal with this? Because it isn't simply in the past where scientists used to think this is just the lay population, all we have to do is educate them. Sometimes you're talking to contemporaries who just got a different perspective. And is a different perspective enough? And how does evidence work and trust work in this? So A nice, easy question for you.
Okay.
Why not, Debbie? Go on.
Well, I've been in this position a lot, because when you take place in debates, you're generally both academics or you're both researchers, and you might just look at the data and differ in your interpretation, especially if there's a lot of uncertainty. And I can say when there's massive uncertainty, scientific consensus is lacking. And as the pandemic evolved and we had more and more data, I would say actually consensus is pretty tight across the world on where we are and where we're going among experts. But I often would come back to have people think logically for themselves. So for example, focus protection, you mentioned, and this was often raised, which is, can you take away those who are most risk of COVID and make them shield? And some light touch version of this, it wasn't light touch for those who were affected, but basically they tried to identify those who were shielding, put them aside, and everyone else continues their life. And another version of this was that, you know, anyone who's under 40 or 50 continues their life, you put them into schools, and everyone else just waits for the wave to go over, right? This was the initial idea around herd immunity. And what I would try to come back to is you couldn't say, oh, he's wrong, I'm right, or she's right and I'm wrong. You know, I would know, what would I say I'm wrong? I don't know. And so what you come back to is actually logic. So I would say, okay, where's tried this? Where in the world has done this? People say Sweden. I was like, Sweden's care homes are one of the worst in terms of their death rates. Shielding didn't work there. So where else has this worked? And you would often get silence, but it works in a model, or it could work theoretically. And I'm like, well, of course, maybe if we could go around, each had a marker, death, severe disease, asymptomatic. We all had labels. Would it have worked then, like in a model, in a computer simulation? Could you have taken all the asymptomatics and put them into a village, right? And said everyone else at risk of death, go hide? Well, you can look around the world. Cuba tried something like this with HIV quarantine camps. If you were positive with HIV, you went to a camp. You can live there. They didn't call it a camp, right? They called it a sanatorium where you're looked after, but you weren't allowed to mix. Is that where we want to go? So I feel like you could spend all your time saying, he's wrong, I'm right, or it wasn't work. Or you could say, think it through logically. Even if we could, which we couldn't, understand who's most at risk of death. And even if we could say we're separating whole families, right, and moving them into different camps. Is that the society we'd want to have? Would we? So I think I just kind of try to go through logically where it would get to. And hopefully then you reach a position where you can reach consensus, which is, it was a great idea in theory, but when you work it out in practice and the way people live and work together, it just doesn't work. And same with schools, to come back to something I work closely on, we did look at the age profile of teachers, the health conditions, who they live with, could we front to the unions, a young, healthy workforce who could go in. And NHS did this, right? Who was put onto COVID wards? It was the first year med students. They were told, you go on because if you get it, you won't die of it. But actually, if you look at the age profile of teachers, you wouldn't have a workforce. Because when you eliminate anyone who has a health condition, anyone who lives with someone vulnerable, anyone over 50, you're not left with very many people, because most of us live in a society of social relationships, which is what we were trying to preserve through avoiding a lockdown, and you create a different type of lockdown in the end.
But there were quite a lot of scientists that were talking the other way. I mean, again, in the Sage Minutes of the 10th of March, they recommended cocooning.
You really have read them.
I've read them too, yeah.
Yeah, they were a fabulous read. If you have trouble sleeping, I can recommend. It actually recommended that cocooning should be focused on people aged over 70 and those of any age in vulnerable groups. In the BMJ on 28th of May, David Spiegelhalter from the Winton Center for Risk and Evidence Communication published a paper with George Davies Smith on shielding from COVID should be stratified by risk. And then, of course, famously, the Great Barrington Declaration in October, which for uncertain reasons seemed to have generated a huge opprobrium, although there had been these others suggesting the same thing. And I think, Debbie, you've kind of commented in your book that this was kind of fringe scientists being pushed by right-wing sources. But I mean, it didn't seem to be. It seemed to be actually generating a more uncertainty rather than trying to resolve it. It became very, very polarized around that whole idea.
And I think that's the difficulty, the polarization. First of all, the information deficit model of science communication really only goes so far, and it doesn't go very far, because it's not just expertise that we should be thinking about, it's how you empathically interact with the people you're discussing a particular issue with. And there are these, it's not so easy for scientists, I think, to engage with the concept of emotional determinants of health, but there are emotional determinants of health. The state of your mind, whether you're sad or fearful or anxious or feeling depressed, or that affects the way you perceive knowledge as it might be coming into your brain. And depending upon your emotional state, that will change the way that knowledge influences you and will change your beliefs. So we need to be much more subtle and cognizant about that, and just thinking that we can pile on facts and have people on the Today program who are professors of respiratory medicine who are going to give the nation their golden nuggets of wisdom. That ain't going to work for a lot of people, and clearly it didn't. I snuck into the back of the Quakers Hall on Euston Road at one of Asim Malhotra's meetings. Sorry to keep mentioning him, but he's a very dangerous figure. And there are 1,000 people in that hall, and he was putting up slide after slide after slide about the harms of vaccines. And 1,000 people were going to leave that hall and spread those messages in their own personal worlds. I mean, why is it that we should be asking, why do people believe these things? And it is not for lack of information, it is because of trust deficits, because we don't listen to the questions that they answer, we don't take them seriously, we don't engage with them respectfully. It requires a very different approach to science communication, which we're not well trained to do, and in some ways is something of anathema for us.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, but I think it's also, there's more to it than that. You know, this idea of sources of authority, they really have expanded. You know, there was a time, valid debate and different views are sort of core to the scientific principle, but it used to all happen behind closed doors. And often it was, editors and editorial journals that would define actually, through the peer review process, which of those voices was the most reliable and authoritative, and that would get published, and it would be a slow process. But now, it doesn't happen behind closed doors. It's an open cage fight on TikTok between academics, and before, when I would have had a debate with other academics, it would have been in private, but now it's in public. And the only person who's ever blocked me on Facebook is another Oxford academic. And so you have this sort of democratization of authority, through the social media, which in some ways is probably a good thing, but it also has unleashed, great difficulties. And I don't know how you deal with it, because, trying to be a strong voice in that environment is actually very difficult. You need a lot of time to be a voice in social media. You have to spend a lot of your day tweeting and blogging and doing other things, which many people don't have.
And I think this gets us back to this question of who does the public actually trust? It's not, if you have two academics with equivalent experience but completely polarized views, how does the public go about making an informed decision? And how do they trust any of the information that's given? I think this is essentially, for lots of people who are watching these things unfold, I think this was the issue. And there's something to be said about the way in which the media sometimes portrays two different views as equivalent. And lots of people in the climate change debate have also argued against this point, that you're going to bring this person on and this other person, and they're presented as equivalent, and the public are told to go off and make their mind up. And there's something also about the way in which, not to blame everything on the media, but the way in which those stories are portrayed that gives them an equivalence that can sometimes be part of the problem of misinformation. So I don't know if you have any views on that.
Well, I don't think it's the scientists who are always going to be the best communicators there. It's going to be, and this sounds, this can sound very like I'm trivializing it, and I'm really not intending to trivialize it, but better to have somebody who is a public figure, who will be recognized and respected and trusted from somebody's, you think about segments of the population, and that person, in a sense, can communicate to that segment of the population, whether it's a celebrity, whether it's a footballer, whether it's somebody from the television who will be well known, somebody from a soap opera. Again, I don't want to sound like I'm trivializing the science, but in terms of getting the message across, in terms of communicating, that is probably going to be more powerful than having a professor from UCL.
So this gets us all the way back to the question around expertise. What's the value of an expertise if actually then it's better for somebody else who isn't an expert to present the news to the public?
The reliable
So
evidence.
you're the kind of backstage.
If I could pick up on this, because actually I think talking about public debates about this is just because not everything has to be debated. And that's the thing I think we also have to get away from. Like, we don't need to debate, is the earth flat? There are debates happening, but it's not really necessary. So I think there also needs to be, I feel sometimes...
A third of American school children are not convinced that the earth is round.
Are they like 2?
No. This was a report recently in the New York Times, shockingly worrying.
Okay, well, maybe we do. But then again, it's not a debate, right? You're not going to take a bunch of school kids and be like, half of you debate. I think coming back to it, that the dangers also, and I want to bring in vaccines here, is that those who are anti-mRNA vax or anti-all vaccines or anti the COVID vax, they're all different camps. They will happily debate because they'll come out and they'll throw stories. Those who are called pro-vaccine, whether it's pro-mRNA, childhood vaccines, COVID vaccines, and there's differing views on each, even among the academic community of which vaccines are needed in what parts of the world and what age groups, they don't want to do it anymore because all you get is an onslaught of abuse, hate, and people telling you you're captured by the pharma industry and you've got blood on your hands. So what I've often noticed is like when media companies might call me and say, will you come on this debate? I will just say, well, what is it on vaccines? And I'm like, do I want to do this and know that for 3 weeks I will get an onslaught of stuff? Or do I just say, actually, pass, but I could recommend you 3 colleagues, and they'll call me and say, why'd you give my name? I don't want to do it. So in the end, what they get is someone who's really willing to come out, like a Nassim Malhotra, and come out and talk about that. And they say, who's going to debate him? And there's a vacuum. They say, see, there's a vacuum. And there's no one willing to debate him. And I'm like, because they don't want to deal with 3 weeks of onslaught of various things. And I think that's why I come back to, why is there such a huge camp arguing one way, and there's not that same voice for vaccines in the stories of how many millions of lives they've saved? You talk about MMR, DPT, polio. You can go through them, and then you can move to COVID, and you can move to mRNA, but there's a whole story of vaccines that have just become discarded because of someone railing against, do the risks outweigh the benefits in a certain age group, and him saying, no, we shouldn't be using them, and others might say, yes, we should be using them, and that just has colored the whole thing. So I think now coming back to disinformation, there is a real hesitation. I think Chris Whitty mentioned this in his COVID inquiry testimony, a real hesitation by experts to come forward because of the personal cost and the question of why. Because it's not our job, and that's what Richard's highlighted. Our job is not to go on TV. It is not to show up at public debates. It is actually to do research, teach students, do the admin tasks in our university, and make sure we're a functional member of our department, which we all try to be in our own way, though some heads of departments might disagree, looking at the state of their department. And so I think it's not our job to go on BBC Newsnight and debate, does mRNA vaccines work? The people who are doing it are generally doing it because they want to do something in the interests of public news and media, and they think people should know this and have awareness and that they should be known, right? And I think we're discussing this before. What is the value of that? And the truth is, I think a lot of researchers are like, I'm going to write my paper, hopefully get it into the Lancet, and then hopefully, teach my PhD students, and then go home and have a cup of tea, and only get a nice box of chocolates at the end for thank you, professor, for what you've done. So why would you expose yourself? And so yeah, it's the dangers, I think, of debates in the public eye, which I think Peter's also talked about.
Well, that's a nice positive moment to hand over to the audience to ask questions. The solution to that is to be like me and completely Luddite and not on any social media. I've never been abused in that way. I did, however, have someone camp on the second floor of my building outside my room for a week, alleging that the recovery trial was done deliberately to show hydroxychloroquine didn't work in order to sell the Oxford vaccine. I knocked on the window and tried to explain that I had not had anything to do with the recovery trial and that Peter Horby was in another building. So are there other questions or yes, Richard Peter wants to find out about his paper. So here at the front.
On now? Okay. So 70 years ago, we had a situation where more than half the deaths in this country were due to one thing, which was tobacco. The evidence came out in the early 50s, and it was bitterly resisted, and the people who were generating the evidence got attacked. And they took a decision that they would try to generate evidence, then try and keep separation between those who generate the evidence and those who do argue the case in public. And the same is true when you do a trial, or when we do breast cancer meta-analyses or something. Try and keep separation between the generation of the evidence and making recommendations. You know, generate evidence and don't make... I think that there's something to be said for that. And if somebody had been doing a study, for example, on the extent to which face masks will, catch droplets and so on, and how much they'd reduce droplets, to have the people generating that evidence not being the ones that make the recommendations, I think this is a useful distinction. I mean, obviously one has an opinion as to whether it's nice to see a big reduction in tobacco, but in a sense, saying half of all smokers get killed by stopping smoking works isn't the same as saying don't smoke or ban advertising. And I think it's worth trying to keep a separation, and I think that, but it's difficult. But I think that would help. It certainly won't deal with problems, but it will help.
Yeah, Ken Rothman used to argue that point very, very assertively. He wrote it in Modern Epidemiology, and in his courses he used to teach. He would really encourage young epidemiologists to separate out the doing of research from the promulgating the messages or the conclusions of that research in policy, because he felt that there was a risk of a contamination between the two, and that actually you would undermine public trust in the former if you became a protagonist in the latter.
But that's the guidelines. Say a paper should contain recommendations at the end. I disagree with those guidelines.
And that's completely at odds with what's now required from grant funders. You now have to do. This morning, I was writing a 4-page dissemination, impact, and exploitation section of a grant application. You have to fill it in, or you don't get the grant. So there's an expectation that you take on this role, which I don't think I'm well qualified for, and I don't think we should be asked to do it.
With respect to the...
It's sort of quite difficult to interpret, just publish them and then let others argue through them and publish them clearly and correct mistakes if they get misquoted. But other than that, I think separation from guidelines from evidence is a good thing.
In the pandemic, though, there was this criticism of publication by press release. And I think this was something that Peter, you had to manage with respect to particularly the dexamethasone results and recovery. Yeah. Do you wait until it's in the journal? And to paraphrase kind of Richard's comments to Richard Horton, people don't know the results and people are dying. So, I mean, how did you manage that, if you like? And in that respect?
Yeah, we did preprint, and I think I wrote an opinion piece that I thought preprints were good, a good thing, because journals take a long time to publish papers. It takes months and months and months. And when you're in a pandemic and you've got a treatment that works, or you've got a treatment that you think doesn't work or is harmful, then I think you need to get that data out, and you can't always wait. And that does present a problem to people, because then people can preprint any old nonsense, and you do need to be able to sort of filter it out. But one hopes that the people who are making decisions are able to filter out from that stuff the credible groups and the credible data from the other stuff.
The question over there, Danny.
I wondered which European country you thought had...
Could you say who you are?
Sorry, Danny Dorling, School of Geography. Geographical question. Which European country do you think best handled misinformation and did the best job of explaining how uncertain we were to its population.
Debbie, you want to kick off with that one?
Yeah, so I actually think in Europe, Denmark is one to look at. I think they have high trust in their government, and their communication was quite clear, and they're probably combining in terms of their excess mortalities, we look back, as well as the restriction, the stringency index the Blavatnik School has created, did the best balance between keeping society moving while limiting the spread, and then achieving high vaccination rates. But I think that's historical. It's not like they started on day one, coming back to the point. I mean, this was built over decades. And so I think that's the tricky thing, that so much of pandemic preparedness, we focus on things like vaccines, diagnostics, lockdowns, unfortunately now are so edged into people's minds, where actually it's about what's the health of your population, what's the trust, where's your healthcare sector at, what kind of messaging do you have to your public that's clear? And they moved Denmark very quickly to not saying COVID's not a threat, but actually get tested. And so they had, I think at one point they were doing 6 times the number of tests per person that we were in Britain. And they were like, well, if you're on your way to work, get tested, and go ahead. And yeah, but it's tricky, because then it comes back to, the game didn't start January 2020, and we all said go. It had started years before of where your healthcare services were. And I think looking at the NHS today, a lot of the woes are blamed on COVID. You can go back a decade before. It was building. It was building. COVID probably broke it because of that additional pressure. But a lot of the problems were already built in from before the pandemic, and the pandemic just accentuated that and kind of accelerated whatever trend was happening already.
Maybe we all have our own favourite European country. I think my favourite would be Germany. The Robert Koch Institute learned a lot of lessons from the mishandling of previous epidemics, influenza epidemics. They did a very good job of keeping a certain distance from government. So they were careful not to allow the impression of a collusion between scientists and politicians. So the RKI tried to protect its scientific independence so it wouldn't get mixed up in the politics. The other aspect of Germany that worked very well is they had a very devolved laboratory system across the country, so they had the testing capacity which we didn't have. And that also allowed them to get a lot of data relatively quickly, which again built confidence, public confidence that they weren't flying blind early in the pandemic. But the truth is probably we can learn a little bit from all sorts of countries, but I'd vote Germany.
Question to Ed.
Hi there. So I'm Ed Sykes, formerly the Science Media Centre and currently at UK Biobank. So my conflict of interest is that Rory is my boss. Just 2 quick points and then a question. So first, you mentioned about having, Richard, about having footballers and things put out the messages, and totally see the value in that when we've got messages where we know what needs to be said. But we do know that from research the scientists are heavily trusted, and when we've got the uncertainty, then we do need to have the scientists kind of stand up. And actually, going on to that, Debbie, you mentioned about how you may not want to do these interviews, or you have done a number of them, and you get all the backlash and the hassle for the next 3 weeks and things. And totally agree, not all scientists do want to do this, but we need to perhaps consider more ways to support the scientists that do, to recognise the work they're doing, because the scientific community needs to have that too, as you mentioned, Richard, to pre-bunk the issues that are going on so that people are aware of it, and it's not dropping into the controversial conversation at the point when the emotions are high and the decisions need to be made. So my question for you all is, now that we've been through this, do you think, I mean, as individuals, I'm sure you've all learned a lot about communication, misinformation, uncertainty, but do you think that organisations have? Do you think the governments have? Do you think that the publishing sector has? Do you think that we would now do better in the next pandemic for misinformation?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Well, you're heading up the Pandemic Preparedness Centre, so I think this is one for you, Peter.
Well, I think we've all learned that doing the science is not enough. You need to do a lot more than just do the science, or somebody needs to do a lot more than do the science. I was horrified to learn that azithromycin was still on the national treatment guidelines of an African country. when there is absolutely zero basis for giving it, apart from for bacterial infections. Whether academic institutions see it as their role, I don't know. It's very difficult. I'm torn between the feeling that actually it's not my job. You know, my job is to do the science and to give science advice. It's not to be a communicator. But at the same time, when you hear a lot of things out there which you know are wrong, or misinformation, disinformation, or even made up, then you feel someone's got to do it, and you try and do it, but you know, maybe don't do it well enough. So I think institutions probably need to be made to take it on board in a sense, in that they need, you know, providing communications expertise within our scientific groups comes down to the PIs to raise the money for that. And actually, perhaps it should be centrally supported, that there is, you know, a really strong communications to all the scientists, and there are a cadre of people, of spokespeople. So WHO used to have, you know, spokespersons who were professional communicators who would be the people who would be put in front of the cameras and would talk about the policy and the science, etc. They seem to have stepped back from that, but I think that's probably not a bad thing. I mean, it's not a bad thing to have spokespeople who do that for a living.
Of course, I guess Tony Fauci has become a spokesperson that now has a full-time security detail. And as Debbie said, it's not a great life, is it? Andy Pollard.
Andy Pollard, the director of the Oxford Vaccine Group. First, just to answer the question about who do people trust. So for the last 20 years, our public health agency has been doing a survey every year of parents to try and understand who they trust most about vaccines. And the answer consistently, year on year, through the last 2 decades, has been their GP is the person they trust the most. Perhaps in the pandemic, because GPs were fairly inaccessible, maybe that was a bit of a problem, and we need to think about that, given that even now, parents still want to talk to their GP rather than anyone else, not their family or a neighbour, or even the practice nurse who gives the vaccines, it's the GP. The point I wanted to come on to was just about bias and the accusations of bias that there have been. And there's two examples that come to mind from my experience. One was lots of people attack the BBC for being quite biased and reporting a lot on the Oxford vaccine. And so I asked the health editor why they were biased and reporting on the Oxford vaccine. And the answer was that none of the other developers would talk to them during 2020. And so that's why they came to Oxford and talked to scientists here, because other people wouldn't talk to them. And I thought, well, that was quite interesting. There's something that perhaps we do need to address. And the other was about publishing, and this is relevant for Richard, that in the US there was a view that the data from Oxford couldn't be trusted because it was published in the Lancet, and the Lancet's conflicted because it's a British journal with a British editor. And I just wonder whether Richard discussed any of that with the New England Journal and other major medical journals, that there's a perception of conflict because of the country that you come from.
Well, that's awful. I'm half Norwegian, first of all, so you should have sent it to the Norwegian Journal of Medicine. Oh my goodness, I mean, this is where you end up chasing your tail on some of these things, isn't it? I don't even know how to answer that question. I certainly didn't know that, I'm surprised that the other vaccine manufacturers weren't willing to go and discuss, because certainly BioNTech folks were doing all kinds of interviews in magazines and newspapers, and I mean the story was a very compelling one. So disappointing that they didn't. The story of the AstraZeneca vaccine, such a missed opportunity globally, and difficult to know why, for me anyway, to understand why the United States turned its back in the way that it did. And I still don't understand the full story. I can't believe that publishing the paper in the Lancet was the reason for that. I'd love to think we had that kind of power, but I'm afraid we don't.
There's an interesting comment, actually, in Kate Bingham's book about that, where she said that after the Pfizer-BioNTech had already released their amazing data, 3 different numbers for efficacy for the Oxford vaccine were reported in The Lancet. 62%, 70%, and 90% according to the dose administered. And she said that that kind of led to rampant claims on social media of spin doctoring in an attempt to drive its own number closer to that of the 94% efficacy linked to its rival. So she put that down to one of the things that may have caused some problems in the book.
The problem is people didn't read the paper to understand the paper.
Yeah, of course.
And that's what happened at the beginning of the pandemic. People didn't read the 6 papers we published in the last week of January, which actually described almost every facet of the pandemic for the next 3 years. But if they read them, they didn't read them properly. But I think a lot of people didn't even read them because it was all there in those 6 papers. I read them. You read them, I know. But honestly.
Question at the back there.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a couple of points about uncertainty and advising politicians.
Could you say who you are, please?
Oh, Les Klein, member of the public. Politicians kept saying that they were being guided by the science. That was never totally true, I guess, because there were also economic and social considerations. But what happened in the early days when there was great uncertainty? So how did you advise politicians? Did you say you don't know, or did you advise them and then maybe change your mind? On a related point, I'd like to ask about the role of the WHO, because Matt Hancock, in his evidence to the COVID inquiry, said that at one point he overruled some WHO guidelines. I think they were in relation to not thinking much about the effect of border controls or lockdown, and he overruled that. So how did the uncertainty affect both your and the WHO's advising politicians?
I don't know whether Debbie or Peter want to kind of comment from the perspective of being on SAGE or equivalent in Scotland in providing guidance where one could, and describing uncertainty, I suppose, also where one had to. Debbie, do you want to?
Yeah, so on Matt Hancock's comments about the WHO, I don't know what he was referring to, because if you were following the WHO press briefings, which I was, which they were doing on a daily basis, they were saying containment. That was their clear message. They were criticized for that message by people who said actually it was too harsh on it. But if anything, they were the ones saying, find every case, trace every contact. There is a way that we can manage this still. Don't give up on containment. That was their message through most of January and February. On advising governments, how did we each, I mean, guys, we each have our story. For me, I was not actually directly involved in advising early on because I work largely international public health, and in a sense, you're not going to advise the UK NHS because infectious disease is not, let's say, a major threat. It's people who work on cancer and tobacco and alcohol. So in Scotland, there's a huge community of alcohol researchers because that's a major burden of disease. It's not necessarily if you're researching measles, that's kind of not your main priority. And it was only in March when there was that press briefing where Boris Johnson came out and said, like, we're giving up on containment, that I felt very confused, because if you had been listening to the WHO press briefings and following South Korea and following the Diamond Princess cruise ship and read those 6 slants of papers, it felt really baffling. And they said, we're following the science, but the science, coming back to Peter's point, wasn't published, so they wasn't even clear what they were following. And so at that point, Nicola Sturgeon decided to form her own Scottish COVID advisory group because she wanted to have more direct access to the information and also tailored to the Scottish context. And so through that group, we, I guess, were variously recruited, and she went for, I guess, with her team, diversity. So I can tell you the debates we had, and we had very different views, people from all different backgrounds. But I think we reached a better position at the end because I had to reflect each time, could I be wrong on this 10 times? Because if you're with someone pointing out every flaw in your argument, you have to think them through. If you have someone saying, you're right, you don't actually challenge your brain or look at the data closely enough. If someone's saying, I think that's the whole point of peer review, right? It's someone to rip it apart and find any flaw you might have missed. And then it became actually, policy papers, actually like ministerial briefings, and trying to kind of feed into government advice. But again, the advice we were asked was very different to what people thought it was. We were never asked, at least maybe Peter's different experience, we were never asked, should schools be shut? We were asked, what is the risk to children of schools being open? What is the risk to teachers of a disease if, let's say, half the workforce gets it? We were asked database questions, and then the trade-offs over what you do with those comes down to ministers, right? Because it was all trade-offs, values, calculations. And I think it was easy for them to say, we're following the science and blame scientists, because it took
the deflection away from social and economic concerns that people were raising by saying they told us to do it. I never had that kind of power. I don't think most people did. When people tell me you shut gyms, I was like, I'm sorry, I wish I had a magic wand to open and close things, but I don't. But I was asked, what is the risk of transmission in a gym environment? And you can answer that through looking at various epidemiological studies, looking at a gym environment, and you can give them that information. What they choose to do with that is a value-based question for a society. And I think that got entangled in this following the science. The science can answer database questions or particular risks of transmission in different settings. It can tell you, that's what our team did, what other countries are doing to try to manage a policy challenge and the impact those policies are having on the trajectory of an epidemic. It cannot tell you, this is what you should do. That's up to why we elect politicians, to look at that and make an assessment based on the preferences of their population, what actually is the final decision being made. But unfortunately, that got all muddled, I think, through the course of the pandemic between, the questions that were being asked of scientists kind of molding to become more and more policy and more away from scientific.
So, Sarah Darby.
Can you hear me? Yes. I'm Sarah Darby and I work in the Nuffield Department of Population Health. I'd very much enjoyed this discussion, and I wonder if the panel could comment on a particular point that I still have very much uncertainty in my mind about. So from the point of view of you guys who are sitting on NervTag and SAGE and what have you, at what point did it become very clear to you that COVID was much more of a threat to older people than younger people? And as a corollary, did it, at the point that the decision was made to discharge as many people from English hospitals as possible into care homes, was it clear that that was an unfortunate decision, or was that, or did it just turn out to be so later?
Very, very good question. I can't remember exactly when it became apparent, but it was fairly early on. It became apparent that the death rate was highly, associated with age. And I'd have to go back through the minutes in the same level of detail as Rory has to tell you when it was. But the care homes one is an interesting one, and I have been going back over some of the minutes in preparation for the COVID inquiry, and the scientific advisory committees did raise the issue of care homes. We were seeing increasing transmission in care homes. We were seeing high rates of, in Easter 2020, there were some outbreaks in care homes, and they were called the Easter Six. Sounds like some sort of, murder mystery. But the Easter Six, and there were 6 care homes where some very good studies were done by Public Health England, where they swabbed all of the staff and they took blood from all of the staff and all the residents. And it became clear from those studies, and it was emerging, we were looking at the data every week, that transmission was very high in nursing homes, asymptomatic transmission in the staff and the patients, and that there was a high fatality rate. And so we did raise concerns with government about discharging people from hospital without testing, which is what was happening. And so I think that was a mistake. That was a policy mistake to do all that discharge. But the NHS decision making, I wasn't privy to the pressures that they were under in the NHS as to why they needed to get rid of people. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I take the point, Peter, that the minutes are rather sketchy, but the first mention I could find of care homes in the minutes was the 25th meeting on the 14th of April.
You could be making it up,
No.
On the 13th of February, there was one on prisons, and actually came up with the point that one of the biggest risks was transferring prisoners from one prison to another, but there was nothing on care homes, and I found nothing about the concerns of moving people from the NHS to care homes. And of course, there was also that kind of very famous stay home, protect the NHS, save lives slogan, which then resulted in people not going to hospital for emergency treatment of heart attacks and for strokes, and indeed presenting for colorectal cancer. So there were clearly some mistakes made there. There's a question over there.
Hi, I'm Tanvi Rai at the Department of Primary Care. My question was about the hierarchy of evidence and how, like, going forward, like learning from this pandemic, which affected so many countries all over the world, whether we can learn something about what we believe is evidence. And I mean, the masking is obviously one example, but you can't always do a randomized control trial, and whether there are any lessons that we've learned from this experience of the pandemic. And we're told that the chances of having another pandemic are quite high. Like from observational data, we obviously are talking about enormous numbers, and what the panel thinks about the value of these other kinds of evidence.
Okay, shall I?
Actually, I think to add to that point about evidence, I don't know if you can hear me, is also the issue around published peer-reviewed journals that then are retracted. So during COVID, we had the largest number ever of retracted articles in peer-reviewed journals. So then what's the status of evidence if what we've relied on is scientists publishing and then those that then become retracted? Becomes very, very difficult to understand what the actual evidence base is, I think.
Yeah, I think the hierarchy of evidence is a challenging one, because you obviously we have faith in the the randomization, the placebo-controlled trial, etc. But it's not always possible to do that. And during the pandemic, and in most circumstances, there's clearly a need for a decision to be taken. And doing nothing is a decision as well. So not closing schools is a decision. Not making any statements about masks is a decision. And you only have the evidence that's in front of you at that time. You either take a decision, well, you have to take a decision, which includes doing nothing, and you only have the evidence in front of you. But I do think then it comes down to what's the possible positive and negative impact of what you do. There are some things that you can do that are likely to have very minimal impacts, like mask wearing. There are others that could have very significant long-term impacts, like closing schools. And so then the decision it becomes more difficult when the impacts are more complex. And so then it's beholden on you, I think, to think very carefully about all the evidence that's available, the quality of the evidence, and really to triangulate the data to really see if different sources of evidence are telling you the same thing and the direction of travel is starting to look clear. I think that it's a mistake to just rely on sort of one type of evidence and one source of evidence, where there may be substantial biases or confounding, because it could be right, but it could be completely wrong, and you might make the wrong decision.
I realise we're running over slightly, but last couple of questions. I think there's one over there, and then there's one here.
George Davies-Smith, epidemiologist, University of Bristol. With the realisation of the foreseeable huge increase in inequalities in educational attainment, the massive growth in ghost children literally not going to school in working class families, and this sort of huge transfer of risk from intergenerationally down and irreversibly down onto this group, balanced with the fact that, for example, teachers in England and Wales had the same mortality rates as people in the same socioeconomic level during the pandemic. With that evidence now, in a future pandemic, would you be less certain about how you'd put the balance of the risks and benefits of closing schools?
Debbie, you want to kick on?
I can say that I was never in the decision-making power of being able to open or close schools. I just want to say it there, everyone says, do you open schools, you close schools? I get that shouted at a lot at me, and actually neither is true. I think what we have to look at each point is what was the blockages to keeping schools open. So at the start, as I mentioned, it was concern about the health of children. It really was. When that moved, it became the concerns of unions over their teaching staff, and that was not just unique to Britain. That was happening in the States. Remember Trump saying to teachers, you are martyrs, go serve your nation, right? Teachers don't want to be martyrs. That language does not work with teaching staff. They quit and they go do something else. And so I think rather than having this debate over should schools be closed or open in the future, it should be what are the blockages that kept schools closed so long, and how can we work on them now? I mentioned Denmark because they were remarkable on schools. They had the shortest closures in Europe. They closed, they opened. And they did that through using big stadiums, They used big purpose spaces. They got their teaching staff out. And that's what I want to learn from them. I'm like, how did they do it? What did they do to plan for that? Because there were blockages. A big one was teaching staff and their concern over their safety and going home to vulnerable members, which is a realistic concern. And so I wish that was what we could learn going into the future, which is if we want to keep schools open, everybody agrees schools open is better. And we knew the damages before. Schools were closed during the West Africa Ebola outbreak. We know girls never went back to school. They got married off. You had them becoming pregnant. We knew it going into it. I don't think anyone was thinking, oh, we're not going to foresee it. I think is what was the blockage at each point that meant that we couldn't get them open faster? Who got them open faster? And what can we learn from those countries? And it's that coming back to hierarchy of evidence point. I think sometimes in a crisis unfolding in different places, people often would say to me, well, why do you think when universities open in Britain, we're going to see college campuses full of cases or college towns? I was like, the United States just went through that a month earlier because they go back earlier. I was like, you don't need to have an RCT of this university campus opens and this doesn't. It was happening across the world anyways. All you had to do is look across. In the end, we're humans. We have similar social structures across the world in terms of cities, universities, family structures can be different, but generally, we're social beings. Look at what places are doing and do a global kind of comparison of what countries are doing well and why, and kind of pick and choose, as you're saying, from each country of what have they done well and have that humility that,
I would strongly endorse that and say that that was one of the failings of WHO. I think that they did despite the criticism, they actually did a very good job in January because it was very hard to get accurate information at a threshold that they could declare a public health emergency of international concern. Making that call is such a huge call for WHO, and if they get it wrong, their reputation is trashed. So they called it by the end of January, and they had to have 2 emergency committees to get there, but they did it. But then, what did they do after that? Nothing. There were, media briefings with Tedros, but what could have happened was that WHO could have convened the countries of the world to try and learn these lessons. The fact that there were country-specific pieces of evidence that could have been highly informative to other countries, and that was never gathered, and that was a huge missed opportunity, which I hope WHO can learn from.
So last question, and then perhaps I'll ask Patricia to summarize all the discussion and close it down.
So I guess as a comment, Marion Knight from the Nuffield Department of Population Health, I think we do have culpability as scientists. I only stood up to talk about things I knew what I was talking about. There were lots of others in this university, and honestly not in this room, but who stood up, and I was thinking, why on earth are you saying, you know nothing about that, but you're talking authoritatively. I think we do have a responsibility to be able to communicate well to get the impact, and I strongly feel that if I had not been advocating for and on behalf of pregnant women, they probably still wouldn't be in the vaccination program now. But my question, we talked an awful lot about uncertainty, but there was an awful lot we knew with certainty right at the beginning of the pandemic in relation to what good quality science looked like, what to do in a pandemic, who to include, pregnant women being an example in research. And yet that went out of the window. And so my question is, why did the certainty go out of the window?
Well, did it though? Did it go out the window? I mean, I think that there's a lot of criticism of government, but, in terms of, the vaccine development and the clinical trials, I think a lot of it's down to government leadership. We had the chief medical officer, the chief scientist writing letters to every single trust saying, don't give medicines off-label, put people in trials. We had the NIHR, the NHS supporting us, prioritising trials, not letting a Wild West affair of thousands of trials that were ineffective. That took a bit of a while to get going, but I think that there was that scientific leadership in government. And so I'm a bit more optimistic about it than you were. I think it was definitely missing, though, from the public health sphere, where there really wasn't the sort of attention to a scientific approach to implementing public health measures.
Okay, Stu. multiple case series still being published and no thought about population-based data?
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, there was a lot of stuff done and published that was very poor quality. I mean, I don't know if many of you know, but there was an FDA review of clinical trials of COVID-19, and they looked at 2,500 registered clinical trials for treatments of COVID, and they looked at whether they were properly randomized and whether they were adequately powered to give any reliable evidence and any actionable answer, and only 5% were adequately powered and randomized. That's 95% of 2,500 trials were a complete waste of money, a distraction, possibly harmful for patients. And I think the UK did better than most countries in that sense. But there's a lot of culpability there. You know, who funded them? Who gave them ethical approval? You know,
Who published them?
Who published them? I was going to say that, Richard, but yeah, you know. You know, so there is culpability there, but I don't see, and I mentioned this to funders. I've said, you know, you funded this stuff, and they kind of shrugged their shoulders.
So, Patricia, shall I leave it to you to summarize?
You were actually joking. It's impossible to summarize, really, but I think one of the things that's really clear, the more we talk and the more we learn as things unfold, this idea between intentional and unintentional misinformation becomes quite blurry, and actually it seems that it's, in terms of thinking about what is intentional, if somebody publishes something in a journal that's fraudulent and then has to be retracted, you know, you can argue that's a scientist propagating disinformation, not misinformation. So this idea around, you know, just with Marion's point, you know, what happened to the certainty? Where did that go? And where we're now in a space of this uncertainty, I think we've got lots of questions to ask around who's responsible for misinformation. And I don't think it's enough to say that there's this kind of nefarious bodies out there. There is certainly, I think, room for the scientific community to look to itself and its role in some of this. And there are definitely some learnings around how to communicate better, as Debbie talked about, humility, but also the role that politicians have had in certainly distorting some very honest scientific accounts of not knowing and just presenting the data and how that then itself got used. I don't know if you've got any other points.
No, I mean, I think only to say thank you very much to the audience for coming. Thank you very much to Debbie Schridter, to Richard Horton and Peter Horby, not only for coming and speaking today, but all of the things that they were doing throughout the pandemic, I think, to help resolve uncertainty, to help communicate clearly. But just bear in mind what Bill Gates said, we were lucky this time. So let's hope we continue to be lucky and or that we do better next time. Thank you very much, everybody.